Just a quick word about the content on the conclusion section of your dissertation. One of the first things I'd like to get across is the fact that it isn't really a place for introducing new points, nor is it a place where you would introduce your arguments. Both of those things kind of really belong in your discussion section, certainly belong before your conclusion. The dissertation, just like an essay, would be very dull indeed if you were holding back your viewpoints to the very last segment, the conclusion, the final bit. Integrating your thoughts, your ideas, based on your careful consideration of the literature, is an integral part to your kind of main body discussion of an essay and your discussion section of your dissertation. So it's not a place to introduce new points, it's not a place to introduce your arguments, not for the first time at least. So what should we be doing with the conclusion? Well, it's really your opportunity to summarise, to wrap up, to bring together all the main points that you've dealt with in detail in your main body section or the discussion section of your dissertation. Certainly it's appropriate for you to discuss there any unforeseen constraints that occurred on obtaining the evidence, or how certain constraints on the evidence hampered your research. It's an opportunity to use the conclusion section to comment on changes you would make to your research in the light of having tried it once. You know, we'd all tweak things, I think, to some extent, having run it and seen that, certain things didn't work as we intended. It is really your opportunity in the conclusion section to stress key findings. Certainly it's the place where, perhaps if appropriate, you can make recommendations, identify potential areas that would benefit from further investigation. It's a place where you can reflect on the implications for practice, including implications as far as your own practice is concerned. All of that is valid content for conclusions. Final point, I mentioned that generally it's not somewhere where you'd introduce any new point. The one exception to that rule, sort of an exception to that rule, is perhaps maybe if there is something you need to say in terms of your thoughts on wider applicability of what you've been looking at. You may have been focusing quite narrow, it may have been a case study, and maybe it's helpful to think about the wider context. Does what you've found potentially apply wider than what you've the context in which you've looked at this thing? So if there's any issue of wider context, relevance to wider applicability, then that's possibly a worthwhile thing to discuss in your conclusion as well. So it's sort of a newish point in the sense that you're stepping back and looking at the bigger picture.